Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this latest Queen's Policy Engagement Post-Brexit Clinic. My name's David Phinnemore. I'm hosting today's proceedings. I'm delighted to say that we're not only online, but we're also with an in-person audience here today at Queen's. So yeah, everyone's very welcome. Good to see people. And hopefully we're going to have a good discussion today around some of the issues that we're facing in this post-Brexit environment. I'm joined here today by my colleagues, Professor Katy Hayward and Dr. Lisa Claire Whitten, to discuss with you a number of issues which we think are topical and important regarding Northern Ireland and the post-Brexit situation. We're obviously going to be focusing a fair bit on the protocol and a number of issues around it. What we're going to do, as we've done in previous post-Brexit clinics, is we're going to do a number of presentations and then we'll pick up questions and have a discussion at the end. For those of you who are joining us online, please do not hesitate to put your questions in the YouTube chat, and we'll come to those as we go through the Q&A session. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to start by having a quick review on what's been happening with the protocol since we last met, which was back in March. On the one level, not much has been happening, but things have heated up a little bit in the last week or so. We want to run through some of what has and hasn't been happening. We're going to pick up on one of the particular issues which has seemingly been addressed in the with regard to the protocol, medicines. So Lisa's going to say a few words on that. Katy's going to say a little bit about what's been happening with regard to the Assembly elections, what that might mean for the protocol, and pick up also on some of the issues which are still outstanding in the UK-EU discussions that are supposedly ongoing. And also we're then going to turn to the question of, okay, well, what happens if the UK takes unilateral action? As you're probably very much aware, we're doing this post-Brexit clinic at the same time as we understand the Foreign Secretary is standing up in the House of Commons saying what happens next. Anyway, we'll all look forward to following up on that in due course. And then towards the end, we want to take a slightly longer term perspective and look at one of the key developments for this current Assembly, and that's going to be the democratic consent vote in 2024, and say a little bit about how that's going to or should be operating and what the possible outcome of it might be. Okay, so I say you're all very welcome, and we'll just proceed now with a number of presentations to address those issues that I've just flagged. Okay, so what I wanted to look at first, was, okay, what's been happening? What's been happening with the protocol? If we look back at where we were back in March, we were discussing the protocol in the context of a change of leadership in the UK in terms of who was leading on the protocol. So Liz Truss had replaced David Frost as the co-chair, UK co-chair of the Joint Committee, and was in various discussions with Maroš Šefčovič, the EU lead on the protocol. And what we saw with Liz Truss coming in was arguably a change of tone. She didn't seem to have the same combative attitude which many associated with David Frost, and I think it's fair to say that people were beginning to be slightly more optimistic about there being some resolution to the outstanding issues which exist between the UK and the EU on the protocol. I think it's also fair to say, however, that Liz Truss was also very mindful of the need to reiterate her willingness to trigger Article 16 and in response to some of the difficulties which are being faced with the implementation of the protocol. The last post-Brexit clinic also took place against the backdrop of the suspension or the attempted suspension of checks and controls by the executive in terms of movements of goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, and more dramatically, the resignation of Paul Givan as the First Minister in Northern Ireland. Okay, if we also look back at that period, we saw the first formal meeting of the Joint Committee governing the withdrawal agreement and therefore the protocol. That came together, I think we have that back in 21st of February. Striking because it was the first formal occasion when Liz Truss and Maroš Šefčovič came together. It was also saw the issuing of a joint statement by the two of them and a fair amount of positive attitudes being expressed in and around the meeting, the focus being very much on addressing outstanding issues, further engagement and regular meetings of the various bodies which have been established to monitor the implementation of the protocol. So I think people thought we might be entering a new phase in the implementation of the protocol and addressing the concerns which certainly the UK has about it and the EU has regarding the UK's approach to implementation. But if we look at what's actually been happening since then, and we look at the calendar of March and April, not a lot. It's actually been a very quiet period. And we see that reflected in the fact that, okay, the specialised committee dealing with the protocol met, but there's not been a further meeting since. There's not been a further meeting of the joint committee. Okay. What we also have, however, is some progress around addressing issues. I mentioned medicines. The EU in April adopted EU legislation governing arrangements for the continued supply of medicines into Northern Ireland. That came into force. We also saw a bit of correspondence between Maroš Šefčovič and Liz Truss on the extent to which the UK was meeting some of the commitments it had recently entered into. I think this was a bit of a warning here that actually, despite the positive atmosphere which had been created at the beginning of the year, there were still concerns about the extent to which the UK was fulfilling what it had agreed more recently. What we also have domestically is the Court of Appeal in Northern Ireland essentially dismissing the appeals which Jim Allister and others had brought regarding the protocol and the withdrawal agreement. Okay. But beyond this, relatively quiet in the implementation of the protocol. That changes in May, and we've seen a lot in the last week or so, and we've seen more in the last 24 hours as well. So we've seen the Assembly elections, which Katy will come to later. We've had the Queen's speech, which in some respects was a little bit of a non-event because it didn't necessarily bring forward the legislation which some people thought was going to be brought forward, which would allow the UK to take unilateral action on the protocol. There's been a lot of speculation about unilateral action on the part of the UK, and we're obviously expecting legislation or a bill to be laid fairly soon before Parliament on that. More details are being given today by Liz Truss. And what we've also seen is obviously Prime Minister engaging more on the protocol, both through an op-ed on Monday, but also his visit to Belfast yesterday. Okay. Within all this, however, I think it's fair to say there's been a lot of speculation about whether the UK is going to be taking unilateral action. And we see this in a number of headlines. We've got here Liz Truss constantly warning of the willingness to take action under Article 16. That didn't actually materialise, that action. We've also got the Prime Minister indicating that he would be willing to trigger Article 16. We've got Jacob Rees-Mogg indicating that the UK will be prepared to unilaterally tear up the protocol and aspects of the withdrawal agreement. We've got Jeffrey Donaldson indicating that he is demanding progress on the protocol or unilateral action being taken, and we now know that that's a prerequisite for him entering into an executive. We've also seen Liz Truss upping the ante in terms of insisting that the EU respond within 72 hours, otherwise the UK might move to scrap the protocol. And then also we've got Boris Johnson indicating that he's signing off on plans for some sort of unilateral action. We're assuming he did this morning, and hence there'll be a statement later today. Okay, so although there's not been a lot of action in terms of meetings, in terms of addressing issues, there's not been much news of any progress or not coming out of the discussions. The rhetoric around the protocol has been very much about the UK moving towards some sort of unilateral action, but not necessarily taking that unilateral action. Okay. I would certainly argue that we need to be careful about assuming that unilateral action is coming. And I think what we've seen emerging in the last days or so is also a fairly clear commitment on the part of the UK government to keep on negotiating, to keep on discussing. And we see that in the Prime Minister's statement the other day, which his op-ed in the Belfast Telegraph, indicating, okay, there are issues with the protocol, we need to be seeking changes to the protocol. And then his comment at the bottom here, you see, he seems to argue that there could be a sensible landing spot, that there can be in everybody's interests to pursue that, so that their particular interests can be protected. What we also see is a commitment from him there, or a stated objective, being that we must create the broadest possible cross-community support for a reform protocol in 2024. That indicates that he's got very much on his mind that 2024 vote is going to be taking place. Okay. So the question is, will the UK and the EU get to a point where the issues can be are resolved, that we can have the DUP entering an executive in Northern Ireland, and that some of the tension, which has clearly dominated UK-EU relations in and around the protocol, can be addressed, and that we might move into a smoother period of UK-EU relations around the protocol. I think anybody would be slightly foolish to be predicting too much at this stage, but certainly my argument would be that, okay, the focus is still very much on trying to find a negotiated outcome to the various issues. Although that said, the UK is very much minded to ensure that it can act unilaterally if and when we get to the point where it deems it necessary to do so. Okay. Whether it will or not is another matter, because certainly some of the evidence suggests that, okay, well, issues can be resolved, and one of those issues is medicines. So over to Lisa to say a few words on that.
Thanks, David. So as David mentioned, medicines has been the supply of medicines, one of the issues that has been at the centre of talks between the UK and the EU about the implementation of the protocol. And just to kind of go through a bit of a case study on that as briefly as possible, under Article 5.4 of the protocol, EU laws on the regulation of medicines continue to apply in Northern Ireland. Way back in December 2020, just before the protocol entered into full force on the 1st of January 2021, the UK and the EU agreed as part of a range of so-called grace periods that the new checks and controls that would be required on medicines moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland wouldn't be implemented for 1 year initially. Through talks throughout the course of 2021 and events, and also through consultation, quite extensive consultation with industry representatives in the pharmaceutical industry, the likely implications of implementing EU law checks as would have been required under existing legislation was found to be a real challenge and would likely risk the viability of medicine supplies to Northern Ireland going forward. Just because of the structure of the industry, because of the size of Northern Ireland, and the historic reliance on GB Pharma. So the UK and the EU were both agreed the positions on the need to resolve that and avoid that risk to medicine supplies was one of those rare points of quite strong consensus. So in October 2021, although disagreement on how to deal with that, but anyway, in October 2021, as part of the European Commission package of measures through a series of non-papers that were published to address a range of issues concerning the protocol, including medicines, the EU proposed making amendments to its legislation such that medicines could continue to move from Great Britain to Northern Ireland without entering into that scenario of risk of supply. In April 2022, so as was on the screen earlier, so on the 12th of April, the EU adopted legislation on the 20th. It came into force. This new legislation was approved through a fast-track procedure in the institutions, and I'm not going to go into all of the details, but you can see some of them on the slide there. The new measures did things like remove the need to relocate regulatory facilities from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which industry had said was not really viable in the long term. It removes the need for dual packaging on generic medicines like paracetamol, ibuprofen, moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. It introduces a bridging solution. You may have seen some of the reporting around this issue around novel medicines that had been approved at different rates in the UK system and the EU system. So it provides for a bridging solution in the event that medicines are approved for use in the UK but not yet in the EU. So they can still be available in Northern Ireland. And all of the changes have retroactive effect back to the 1st of January 2022, which kind of meets that initial grace period that was agreed in December 2020. Worth noting also perhaps too that the changes to the EU legislation also make temporary provisions for Cyprus, Ireland and Malta, medicine supplies moving there, and in the form of derogations for 3 years that are similar to what's been agreed for Northern Ireland, but that's to allow for industry to adjust and supply lines to adjust, because those three Cyprus, Ireland and Malta have historically relied on GB Pharma for medicine supplies, which is also just quite interesting because this is sitting in the broader context of the decoupling of the UK from the EU and all of the implications of that. So the practical challenge for supply of medicines to Northern Ireland has largely been addressed, and that's been said to be the case from those in industry here and in civil service here. But it is worth noting, just in the broader context of ongoing tensions around the implementation of the protocol, that the supply of medicines and the issue of medicines has been particularly politically poignant, understandably. Our polling, most recent polling, found that 75% of people, respondents, expressed concern, with 53% being fairly concerned or highly concerned about the prospect of any risk to medicine supplies, very understandably. The fact that the issue has largely been resolved on a technical basis is therefore, I think, a rare positive story regarding the implementation of the protocol. But as the quote on the screen from Boris Johnson's article in Belfast Telegraph last week notes or demonstrates that this is still politically emotive. The idea of these checks and kind of feeds into the broader difficulties around implementing it, the political challenge around implementing the protocol. And the other headline just noted there is from another recent article reporting on testing requirements. When you look at the detail of the story, it's not so much that there was going to be a risk of shortages, but it is more about that broader question and issue around decoupling, and so the operation of the UK legal order and the EU legal order sitting in parallel in the Northern Ireland context. So it's just highlighting the complexities involved in this, even when this is a positive story in the broader context of ongoing tensions.
Thanks, Lisa, on medicines. Over to Katy now, and the Assembly elections.
Thank you. Can I take your clicker? Thanks, David. So, as you may be aware, we've had an election recently, and it's worth bearing in mind that in the 2020 command paper from the UK government on the protocol, it referenced the democratic consent vote in 2024, and it said, there'll be an opportunity for people in Northern Ireland to express their views on the protocol via this consent vote through elections in Northern Ireland. So there was a sense that this Assembly election has significance, given that it will make up the Assembly that then has this democratic consent vote, which David will talk about later. I won't go into loads of detail on this, but looking at the manifestos, obviously, as you might expect, the protocol was there as a feature, and we see the positions laid out by the parties to greater or lesser degree on the protocol. As you know, the TUVs was very much about removing the Irish Sea border. The DUP included a version of its 7-point plan to get rid of the protocol, as was one of many objectives in its manifesto. The UUP's manifesto was clear in terms of removing the Irish Sea border, but it was a little bit more ambiguous about where it actually stands. And having looked at our polling data on this, you can sort of appreciate that, because there is a diversity of views amongst UUP supporters on Brexit and the protocol itself. The SDLP very strongly in favour of the protocol, recognising, as it sees it, some economic potential from it. Sinn Féin seeing the protocol again, emphasising the opportunities from it, as well as benefits as it sees in terms of keeping the Irish border open. And then the Alliance Party spent quite a bit of time in its 90-page manifesto talking about the things it had proposed in the past to try and fix the issues around Brexit and Northern Ireland, and continued to say that it's taking a pragmatic approach. So just to try and put it as simply as possible, when it comes to labelling our MLAs now as being for or against, and therefore how they may or may not vote on the vote at the end of 2024 on Articles 5 to 10, i.e. the Irish Sea border, we can sort of see a breakdown of 54 in favour of keeping the protocol and 36 against. And I should say in this one, we've identified Claire Sugden as the independent unionist as being voting in favour of it. We don't know. It's not possible to find her specific position on the protocol. We've labelled her there because she said in the past it has opportunities potentially for Northern Ireland, but she may well have changed her mind since. So a little bit of doubt over that one. Another point to mention in terms of things that have changed since is that, of course, the UUP is responding to the current conditions. So whereas before the election, as I say, it was slightly ambiguous, but it was emphasising the need for an agreed outcome, so wanting the UK and the EU to have a negotiated outcome. In fixes and alternatives to the protocol, Doug Beattie issued a statement recently in which he says, you know, the UK government needs to act now, sort of almost pretty much implying unilateral action is there as a reasonable tool if the EU won't move at all. So they are still, they're coming out a bit more forcefully against the protocol than perhaps they were even before the election. So we've got different approaches to the problems with the protocol, the question of whether we need alternatives to it or whether we need to protect it. What are the actual issues to be addressed? And this comes to the background that we have before Liz Truss's statement at the moment. And I just thought I'd outline three broad blocks of issues, right? So when the UK government is coming to its negotiations with the EU or to its standpoint with the EU, there are three different types of concerns that it has in mind, okay? So one is the ones that it's laid out in its command paper. And we've included these in our polling to see how people think about it. So the supply of medicines up there at the top. We've also got the customs paperwork. We've got the BCP, border control posts, pet certification on pet movements, subsidy control. We've also got the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice on disputes on the application of EU law under the protocol. So we know that that has been emphasised quite a lot by the UK government in its talks with the EU. Obviously, that's a red line for the EU, and that's been some barrier against some of the progress in the talks. They've also mentioned the importance of including representatives from Northern Ireland's Assembly and from civil society. So those are its concerns that it's repeated up till to date. Another set of concerns that are obviously very pertinent here are those set forward by the DUP. And I thought it safest just to copy and paste its actual 7-point plan on this one. And so you see here, it's not getting into the details at all. It's about the principles. And so in some ways you can see that there may well be scope for negotiation here, and obviously they're experts in negotiation. So there are fundamental principles here. Article 6 of the Act of Union, which is prohibiting frictions on trade within the UK between GB and Ireland, Northern Ireland. Avoiding diversion of trade, removing the sea border is a key principle. no checks on goods going from NI to GB, and remaining in Northern Ireland, and that's key, right? Because they do recognise that there can be checks on goods that may be going into the single market. And the question of dynamic alignment, so no new regulatory borders between Northern Ireland and GB. Obviously, that's not just about Northern Ireland aligning to EU laws on certain matters, but also about GB diverging from them. As we heard in the Queen's speech, it's planning to do. And last but not least, there are several asks that have been laid out, most particularly by the Northern Ireland Business Brexit Working Group. Above all else, and we all know the mantra now about stability and certainty. That's what they want above all else. Disruption and uncertainty is bad for business. So they've been asking for that consistently. They also want, what they're saying is a dynamic solution that can evolve. So recognising the fact that there's not going to be a once-off, that's that done now. It's definitely about forming the basis for an ongoing relationship between the two. There's concern around the cumulative burden of paperwork, particularly if you see an end to the grace periods, of course. And the idea that there's some of the requirements are unnecessary given the nature of movement of goods from GB into Northern Ireland. And fundamentally too, they're also talking about giving Northern Ireland a meaningful, which I think is an interesting word, a meaningful voice in governance structures relating to what applies in Northern Ireland, and also calling for formal review mechanisms. So perhaps learning, you might say, from the implementation of other agreements in Northern Ireland, and also from the fact that we have such review mechanisms for the TCA. So thinking about this as a dynamic, evolving relationship, recognising that you need the structures there to continue to have a voice from Northern Ireland, and so to allow the joint committee to make decisions on the basis of evidence rather than rhetoric. But so solutions, have them in my back pocket for you. I think there are three possible ways of going about this. So one is to continue the talks. I mentioned the need for evidence-based demand. So you can see there are different types of things there. ECJ jurisdiction, for example, is very different to even what the DEP and businesses here have been asking for. But essentially, evidence-based demands could be on the table, particularly around frictions on GB to NI movement. And then you can have recommendations being made from the specialised committee, including on the basis of submissions from North-South Ministerial Council, for example, then can lead to joint committee decisions. Limitation here, as you'll have heard quite a lot recently, is a mandate that Šefčovič has from the EU to be able to move on this. So the flexibility that the EU can show is just as far as the Council has given the Commission to show. And for example, we can imagine that every time the UK government put on the table subsidy control or ECJ jurisdiction, Šefčovič could just say, well, I have no mandate whatsoever to even talk about those things, to open those things up. UK wants that mandate to be expanded. If that was to be the case, it would need the support from all the EU member states. So that's a problem here in terms of, well, it limits the scope for where those discussions might go. Also worry for this, a problem is that the UK has rejected the non-papers from the EU. So anyway, that was a statement last week. They might have changed their mind on that now. But also problem is the lack of trust. And that's the fundamental issue here. The more flexibility you're looking for from the EU, the more they need to be able to trust the UK, really, that they would ultimately intend to apply it. Article 16, you're all experts because you come to these clinics. So I don't need to go into any detail on this. Obviously, it's safeguard measures, and the application of these would be limited in time and scope. They could only come into force after a 30-day consultation period if they're using the correct procedures. If the UK doesn't go down the correct procedures for implementing Article 16, you'd expect to see the issue before the courts the very next day. So we're not talking about a rapid fix here. And of course, we've got the continued existence of the grace periods and the fact that the EU is already at the table. So the question of what practical benefit Article 16 would bring is a real live one. And of course, with Article 16, even if there were safeguard measures, whatever they might be, there's a possibility of the EU using rebalancing measures as well to kind of counteract the effects of that. So it's not straightforward. And then the question of unilateral action. So fundamentally, the principle here would be to enable UK law to change to equip ministers to override the primacy of EU law in domestic law. And this would mean that in the future, they won't be worrying so much about legal challenges to the exercise of powers to disapply all or part of the protocol. So this is a long-term goal. You will need, obviously, it to pass through Parliament. We're talking at least a year here, given the likelihood of pushback from the Lords and potentially from some members of Parliament, including Conservative Party. So we need that time. What happens in the meantime? Very much it's the case that there's no immediate benefit from this. You wouldn't see anything in particular change, but the symbolic gesture is the one that is recognised as being significant, and the significance of that is recognised potentially by the DUP, of course, and also by the EU, and they'd interpret that in very different terms. So even if we have this announcement, and I don't even have Wi-Fi here, so I can't tell what Truss has announced, but it's very much the case that even gearing up to equipping yourself to be able to take unilateral action on the protocol is significant, even though it doesn't bring any immediate practical benefits in the implication and some of the issues that have been identified around the operation of the protocol. Thanks, David.
Okay, over to Lisa. I was going to say a few more words about what the UK might do and then what the response might be.
Yeah, so really just to elaborate briefly and unfortunately probably non-conclusively on what Katy was just outlining around the possibility and options for unilateral action and its consequences. So this slide draws on the excellent work of Professor Catherine Barnard, who wrote an article that I would recommend you go and read in The Guardian recently, that sets out specific legal clauses that the UK government could decide to either trigger in the language of Article 16, that, as Katy said, you're probably all familiar with, the safeguard clause under the protocol, or in the UK law context, to propose to amend, and those all sit under the European Union Withdrawal Act as it was amended. It's 2018 Act amended by 2020 Act, and it implements the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, and there are various parts of it that could be the focus of a UK government announcement or legislation that's tabled in the next few weeks following what the Foreign Secretary is saying right now. So Section 7A of the 2018 Act implements the whole of the withdrawal agreement that could be amended or suggested to be amended. Something to note is just that is quite legally, that would be very consequential because it is a direct effect power, like on to what previously gave EU law full effect in the UK and an earlier act. So the wording would be very crucial on that one. Section 8 of the Act is more specific to the protocol, and it gives UK ministers powers to implement changes that apply under the protocol. So it could be the focus. Also Section 38, a bit more niche, is known as the Sovereignty Clause, which asserts that the UK Parliament is sovereign, so that could be used or amended perhaps in conjunction with others, to change the way in which the protocol currently and EU law that apply under the protocol currently kind of flow directly into UK domestic law. Final one on the screen there is just Article 62 of the Vienna Convention. It's an international law provision, and it relates to provides for a power for treaties to be amended in the case of changes that were unforeseen. There has been some discussion that that could be proposed to be kind of referenced in any UK unilateral action. There are different legal disagreements over whether that could or couldn't apply, and it really does depend on the specific substance and the decision made by the UK government about what it actually is going to change. I realise that's potentially lots of detail, but these are the things that may come up in the next couple of weeks if unilateral action is taken. Along with our colleague Billy, here in the team, we've recently written an explainer on judicial review possibilities and options that exist under the protocol, so enforcement mechanisms and mechanisms to challenge non-enforcement. And you'll be happy to know I'm not going to try to run through all of them. The picture is quite complex and it's novel, but suffice to say that there are different types of mechanisms that apply, and the UK law mechanisms that apply because the protocol applies under UK law, and then those that sit under the withdrawal agreement that are UK EU provisions that have specifically been agreed, and also EU law mechanisms for enforcement that apply because EU law continues to apply here. The nature, what the UK government do or do not do around unilateral action or triggering of Article 16, that will be the terminating factor that means which of these enforcement mechanisms are triggered or could be used. So all of that's to say, again, non-conclusive, but this picture, there's a lot of complexity and fluidity in it, and whatever action is taken will have knock-on consequences and will initiate proceedings. So it's just highlighting the consequences that could be taken. I recommend that you go and read the explainer. Yes, and that's just highlighting the legal complexity and political contingency. Perhaps to avoid a total cop-out in not saying what could or couldn't happen, maybe worth noting that there is legal action that was taken, proceedings that were initiated under the withdrawal agreement in March 2021 that have been paused. If the UK did take some unilateral action or symbolic move, the EU could decide to restart those proceedings and continue those that exist. Also, that, as Katy was mentioning, the possibility of rebalancing measures aren't just specific to the withdrawal agreement or the protocol, but also the trade and cooperation agreement that provides for tariff-free trade, and could be the case. Again, it depends on the substance of decisions made and what the action actually is, but the EU could decide to suspend the trade and cooperation agreement and arrangements under that, and that's where you see talk in the press at the moment around trade wars and how that would play out. There we go, that's non-conclusion. There we go. Thank you, David.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Final bit of presentation by me is going to be looking forward to 2024 and this democratic consent vote. As I said earlier, it was mentioned yesterday by the Prime Minister in his op-ed, where he indicated that the objective is to create the broadest possible cross-community support for a reform protocol in 2024, for when MLAs will vote. Once again, we've produced an explainer on this, available on the website, where we go into a lot of detail about the mechanism, this democratic consent mechanism. But what I want to do now is just run through a few points about it and flag a number of issues. I suppose the first thing to say is that it's a novel provision. It exists because it was part of the renegotiation of the protocol back in 2019 when the backstop was dropped, and the protocol arrangements became essentially a front stop. They came into force with the end of the transition period. Consent mechanism was included in an attempt to assuage unionist concerns about what they see to be the lack of consent for the arrangements. Okay. Important point to note, first of all, is it does not apply to the entirety of the protocol. As Katy's indicated, it applies to Articles 5 to 10, which govern essentially the arrangements for where you monitor the goods moving in and out of the EU market. Do they take place currently as they are at the sea border, or do they move to the land border? Okay, so they relate to those provisions. Okay, that has knock-on effects for other provisions as well, but essentially we're looking at the issues around the movement of goods. Essentially, the arrangement is that if a vote is held, MLAs have to endorse the current arrangements for them to continue. And they can do that by one of two mechanisms, either a simple majority, which is basically a 50% plus one of those present and voting, or they can do it on a cross-community basis. And you see there, you can either have a simple majority, 50% plus of MLAs present and voting, including a majority of those who designate as unionist and nationalist, or you can have a 60% majority of the MLAs present and voting, including at least 40% of those who designate as unionist or a nationalist, hence the importance of the figures Katy highlighted earlier. If you get a simple majority, the next vote or the next opportunity to vote will be after 4 years. If you get the cross-community majority, then the next opportunity to vote on the continued applications of Articles 5 to 10 will be after 8 years. Okay. Important to note here is the opportunity to vote will be held irrespective of whether we've got a functioning executive. Okay, so there's two routes for the vote. One involves the proposal coming for a vote coming forward from the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. If we don't have a First Minister, Deputy First Minister in place, it falls to the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland to initiate proceedings. And even if the Assembly is not meeting, MLAs elected last week will be called together to hold the vote in November, December 2024. Okay, so there will be a vote, and the way in which the domestic legislation has been written essentially ensures that there will be a vote. Okay, what happens? Okay, I mentioned about consent. If there is consent, the green route here, we either have a simple majority or cross-community majority, and then we go back into the process. But during that time, if there isn't cross-community support, we will actually have an independent review after 2 years. So in 2026, there will be an independent review of the protocol arrangements relating to Articles 5 to 10. What we'd also then have, given the timeline, is another election. Okay, and there'd also be a public consultation, and then you'd have the vote. Okay, so for as long as Article 18 exists, there will be an opportunity to have a vote potentially every 4 years. Okay. I suppose a key question, and it's come up in the chat already, what happens if there's no consent? Okay, and that's where we're entering sort of essentially unknown territory, because the protocol only states that after 2 years, Articles 5 to 10 will be disapplied. In the meantime, the UK and the EU will essentially try and agree what happens next. Okay. The default position would be that the terms of the trade and cooperation agreement governing the movement of goods would apply with respect to Northern Ireland and the whole of the UK. That means that the checks and controls and various formalities applying to the goods moving from Great Britain into the EU and from the EU into Great Britain would apply at the land border here. So essentially we're back to 2017 to 2018 when we were trying to address the question, how do you avoid a physical hardening of the border on the island of Ireland? Okay. Now, the assumption is that the UK and the EU will reach some sort of agreement which fits with the spirit of the protocol, which is avoiding the hard border. But there's absolutely no guarantee that that will be the case. Okay. We'll just have to see. It may be that we don't end up going that way because consent will be forthcoming. And certainly, as one looks at the figures at the moment, the indication is that the current Assembly would vote in favour of consent. But the lived experience of the protocol, particularly if the grace periods came to an end, may see a good number of those MLAs changing their mind. And so these figures shouldn't necessarily be seen as us assuming that there will be consent in 2024, but the indication is that we're moving in that direction. Okay, so a lot to look out for, and I think this goes back to the point that the current negotiations and discussions are really important for trying to find some means of resolving the outstanding issues, whether on a permanent basis or part of a dynamic process, which the business community are obviously looking for, such that you have an ongoing sort of review and assessment of what's working and trying to mitigate any difficulties that the protocol and the post-Brexit arrangements between the UK and the EU are throwing up. Okay, so if you're hoping for a point where the protocol disappears from public debate or political discourse, I think forget it, because it's coming back in 2024 when there will be this vote. Okay, so needless to say, there'll be other post-Brexit clinics between now and then to try and help us understand and navigate this fascinating process. Okay, so I think we're going to call our presentation to a halt there. Happy now to move to Q&A. We've got a number of questions coming through online, but happy to take any from the floor here. Okay, gentleman over here.
George Bell, sorry I'm late. Maybe I'm a little bit confused here. I mean, second guessing what's going to happen is pretty difficult, but a good guess might be that what we're in line for is some form of protocol light east-west. That might be a good guess. But what worries me a little bit is that no one has actually built in anything concrete that the citizens of Northern Ireland, through their assembly, could build in their lived experience to shape and manage whatever comes down the line. I think what I got from your last presentation was that the MLAs will get a vote on it. But I think that there's more issues that will arise even in the future. And what is it beyond European legislation or UK legislation to build something into the Assembly when it's operating that actually could influence EU decisions in terms of, we're talking about trade here. And I'm wondering, are there any examples inside the European Union of these sort of committees that might be within other areas of maybe conflict or trading arrangements that are difficult that we could actually look at and build into our own system? Because it seems to me that what we have is the UK, and a lot of people here aren't happy with the UK, we're not happy with the EU, and we have Simon Coveney like a surrogate telling us what can be done. But no, we're not doing it ourselves. I would like to see the citizens of Northern Ireland, through their assembly, having some form of influence beyond just a simple vote on what someone else has given to us. Is that possible, or is that a dream too far?
Okay, thanks, George, for that. For those of you online who possibly didn't hear the question, it's a suggestion here that we may be ending up with a protocol light version of the protocol in due course, but the question being raised is the extent to which opportunities might be created for the voice of Northern Ireland citizens to feed into the governance of the protocol, so that the lived experience can be reflected in UK-EU discussions and any possible solutions to issues. Katy, do you want to say a few words on this? Because I know you've been following the issues around what sort of engagement there has been on the part of the UK and the EU with the issues which are being felt on the ground.
Mm-hmm. So it's a really good question, George, and I would point you, if you're interested, to a report that we did in May 2020, which was looking exactly at these questions, i.e. the question of governance. So how it could be possible for Northern Ireland to have some sort of voice in the application of the protocol and decisions being made around it. Now, outside of the EU, there are very limited means of influence. But there are some specific things for the protocol that are very unusual for the EU to have done. Most specifically, the Joint Consultative Working Group, which doesn't sound very sexy, but essentially what it is that it's a meeting point. They meet every month. It's for officials at the moment. And they, basically, through that, the EU tells the UK the updated regulations that will apply in Northern Ireland, and the UK can update the EU also on its updated regulations. And that all sounds very technical, but essentially what it is around, well, this is this evolving impact of the protocol. So these are this is what the conditions are legally now for Northern Ireland, and it is evolving week by week, and Lisa tracks it for us on our website. So the question is, what they can do then is consult with each other. And if there are potential problems or difficulties, they can relay that up ultimately to the Joint Committee, which is Shefkovich and Truss, and they do have decision-making capacity. There is scope there too to allow for some adjustments within the law. So the question is, it's not just this law applies, but in what particular way? And there basically, there have been proposals put forward, and I know these are being thought about, to be able to have direct stakeholder input into the Joint Consultative Working Group and even into the specialised committee, which is higher up from that. And the EU's non-paper suggests that you can have direct representation from Northern Ireland. At the moment, Northern Ireland is in there, but in terms of officials or observer status, not really involved in the nitty-gritty. And there is potential to put forward suggestions like, looking at the TCA and the fact there's a civil society forum and there's domestic advisory groups, which is expert stakeholders, to be able to say, this is how this is affecting us. Is there any adjustment here? You could do something similar potentially for the protocol as well. But you come back ultimately to obviously the political sensitivities around it. Even when we were in the European Union, Northern Ireland's Assembly wasn't great, let's just put it that way, in terms of scrutinising EU legislation and in thinking through the ramifications for Northern Ireland specifically. But there is potential for Northern Ireland, for example, to have a committee on the protocol, to be able to have an agreed voice from the Assembly, to relay up to the specialised committee and the Joint Committee, this is how this is impacting us. And of course, most particularly to the UK as well, which is making decisions on this. So it's a complicated scenario. And I know the EU recognises the importance of hearing directly from NI. The UK does too, but for the time being, its focus isn't so much around the evolving governance of the protocol, but around the here and now problems. But political parties are recognising it, particularly the UUP has really emphasised the point of the need for more direct input from NI into these, new UK-EU committees. And I suspect, or I hope, over time, as it becomes de-dramatised, as there is a little bit more of an agreement about the future of the protocol, that there might be space for such engagement to take place.
Okay, thanks. Don't know if we've got any more questions in the room, but there's been a couple online, more to do with the democratic consent process and the extent to which could the Northern Ireland Assembly, could Stormont over the next 18 months actually work on producing its own compromise set of arrangements for the protocol? And also, okay, will there be attempts to find out the views of the public in this process? Okay, I think I'm being pointed at here to answer this. Okay, in terms of the public opinion, as part of the project we're working on, we've got another five more polls to do over the next 18 months. So we'll be looking at what public opinion is around the protocol. But that will stop in 2023. The UK government, in its declaration on the implementation of Article 18 and the democratic consent mechanism, did commit to having a consultation 2 years before the vote. So we should be seeing at some point the UK government engaging in supporting at least either the executive running a consultation exercise or the Secretary of State facilitating it. What form that will take, we don't know. It's been suggested here, okay, might there be a civic assembly? The detail is not there, and I think it's going to be one of the interesting things to follow over the next couple of years is the extent to which effective means are put in place to gathering what people's views on what should happen here. Okay. Could Stormont work on a compromise solution? I think there's nothing to stop it working up a shared response to what's been happening around the protocol. I think critics of the executive will often point out there's been very little coming out of the executive over the last 4 or 5 years around how to deal with the consequences of the UK's decision to leave the EU for Northern Ireland. We had a high point in August 2016 where they did issue a joint letter which I think was generally quite favourably received and did prove to be quite influential in at least raising the need to address some of the concerns around what Brexit would mean for Northern Ireland. But we've not necessarily seen that follow-up to that. And I think it'd be a key challenge for the next executive to develop a common position, and also for the Assembly. I think there's a question there as to the extent to which something like the protocol and the Northern Ireland's position in the UK-EU relationship merits some dedicated committee or subcommittee in the Assembly for monitoring what's actually happening and for discussing what options there might be to address the concerns. Okay, we'll have to see. That's going to be in the hands of the Assembly, but there's nothing to stop them engaging on this. Okay. Any other questions in the room? Yeah.
Sorry, Franklin, I don't want to steal the Foreign Secretary's thunder, but goods destined for the EU will go under the full checks for trade to the EU. Her words. First thoughts.
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
Goods destined for the EU will go under the full checks for trade to the EU.
Okay, so goods, the Foreign Secretary has announced that goods destined for the EU will undergo full checks on required of goods to go into the EU. Okay. Katy, do you want to go first?
So essentially you're back to that question of so where the border comes. So what the UK wants to do with that is to be able to say that goods don't have to meet EU standards entering Northern Ireland. So you can have goods coming into NI from GB that meet the standards that are allowed in GB, not EU standards. And then they're saying, but we recognise that those going into the single market need to meet EU standards. But it goes back to, if you can imagine that border, like that diagram I have around the three cornerstones of border management, as part of operating that, you need to know exactly what is coming in, and that it meets the standards for entry, and that if it doesn't meet the standards of entry, it won't go into across the border. And that's the rub. So for the EU, how do we know that those goods will enter Northern Ireland and stay in Northern Ireland, and not go across the border and then enter the EU single market? Now there is potential, so there are several layers in that. The one is around the information that's attached to that product coming in, but the other is the need for checks and controls, and the other is to make sure that it doesn't cross unless it does meet those standards. And I think ultimately, what we mustn't lose sight of is the fact that already we have some measures which minimise the need for checks and controls on everything. So the authorised trader scheme, and the EU has said we can expand this potentially, such that you don't need all the checks and certifications, etc., that we would normally expect on our external border, because these traders are authorised, so we trust them basically. But in that, you need an awful lot of information, and you also need to approve those measures that are being taken by those traders. And the more the EU is prepared to show the more the EU is asked to show flexibility, the more information it wants. And at the moment, the information and the trust is quite low being shared from the UK to the EU. So I think ultimately you can get to a space where there'd be a softening of the idea that everything coming in has to meet EU standards and be checked, etc., etc. But you'll only get there with more information being given and more traceability of what's coming in, so you can be absolutely sure that these things are staying in Northern Ireland. And we've got a long, long way to go on that yet. So to say that it's essentially, you've still got that same question: are these things definitely staying in Northern Ireland? How can we be sure of that?
I think just one thing to add to that. I think if the Foreign Secretary had not made that statement, that would have been really a huge concern to the EU. But the EU does require the UK to ensure that goods going into the EU market do meet EU standards. I think here we need to remember also that the EU has effectively outsourced protection of the internal market to the UK on this particular issue, and this comes back to the question of trust. Okay. Any other questions?
Sorry, David. Lisa Clare, it's Lisa Clare, isn't it? That's right. You mentioned something about the re-entering the controversy on the withdrawal treaty rather than the protocol. Jacob's reason, I'd like to understand better what your perception is of what Jacob Rees-Mogg is saying about engaging or ignoring parts of the withdrawal agreement and what the implications of that might be.
If I, thank you for your question. So the question relates to Jacob Rees-Mogg talking about ignoring aspects of the withdrawal agreement and distinguishing between the protocol and the withdrawal agreement. If I did articulate that, I do apologise, because the protocol is part of the withdrawal agreement.
I know. That's the point. That's
Yes.
the whole point.
So it's not, I was distinguishing between UK law provisions that are specific to the protocol and its implementation, but that's not to say that the two are formally detached in any context. So your question relates to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, was this thing about the change, if there's a re-engagement with or an ignoring or a change in things within the withdrawal agreement, even if whatever they relate to, it could mean that the EU could react on the trade and cooperation agreement or somewhere else. I mean, where do you see that context going? That's the question.
Okay. I mean, very much, I would come back to, it really depends on what the actual action is. So in the provisions that exist in the withdrawal agreement for any retaliatory measures or reaction from the EU, it's all dependent, it has to be proportionate, and so it's going to have to relate to what the action is. So it is hard to predict, it's hard to say, and I'm hesitant to do it if I realise that may not be satisfying, but...
So one thing is, if the legislation undermines Section 7A of the Withdrawal Act, that affects other things than just the protocol, of course. It also affects such things that are included in the Withdrawal Act, such as, withdrawal agreement, such as citizens' rights. And there is, like, if it is a big bang approach here, the EU, its ultimate, it's the biggest thing it could use is to say what we have here is a serious breach of the rule of law. And then it can bring in not just measures for dispute resolution under the withdrawal agreement, but also the TCA, because you're saying this partner here is not observing the essentials of the rule of law, and that's when you have the most potential in terms of the rapid reaction that would affect the trade cooperation agreement. So they're obviously, just as the UK, I think is still, maybe making statements, but I think they're still trying to work out what would be the most effective thing to do here. Similarly, the EU is thinking through its options as well. And at the moment, there's quite a lot of confusing, slightly contradictory briefings, but we know that when the EU one of the reasons why they were keen to pass the TCA and get the European Parliament to approve it was because they knew then they would be much more better equipped for such a thing as the UK deciding to unilaterally breach the withdrawal agreement as it had proposed to do with the UK Internal Market Bill. So it has an arsenal now of other things it can do in response to such actions from the UK side. But obviously, as Lisa says, the key point that it will be bearing in mind is that it has to be proportionate, and for the most part, it would also have to have the approval of all of the EU member states, particularly the most strong reactions.
Could I just check, are we all out of road on an extension of the grace period that might allow even a shadow assembly to be formed if we could further kick it down the road in terms of grace period? Or is there any scope there at all? Let's say, for example, somebody came back and said, look, these are difficult, these are complex, let's have an extension of the grace period for 1 more year. But to do that, then we would like to see at least a shadow assembly up and running. because in that year a lot of people will die, they'll not get their health service, and it would put pressure back on those people who are not willing to form the Assembly. I don't know, maybe it wouldn't, but it would be something. But are we all out of road? Can we keep doing this?
Okay, so certainly, so the UK wants the grace, so they're indefinitely extended at the moment, which is a really bizarre situation, if you like, because it's essentially saying this is a law that should be applied, but for the time being, we're just not going to apply it with mutual agreement. But that's not sustainable in the longer term. So we need to have an agreement as to, well, this is the law that does apply. The UK wants it to be such that the grace periods continue to apply and are agreed with the EU that they will continue to apply indefinitely, if you know what I mean, like the current state is written in, plus a lightening of the rules that currently apply. And that they're currently not applying. Sorry, this is getting complicated. But so reducing the customs paperwork, for example, reduction of that. So they want it a lighter touch than it is at the moment. The EU says, no, we can't have grace periods going on forever. What we agreed has to be implemented at some point, although we are willing to be flexible in some ways, and here are our fact sheets explaining what we're prepared to do if you're prepared to move as well. If they both see, this is a weird situation because we don't have an endpoint now for those grace periods. We just have an unease on the EU side that they're there, and from their mind, the sooner we can come to a clear, concrete landing zone, the better. I don't think now. I definitely do not speak for the DUP. I don't think like continuing on saying, oh, we'll just extend for another year would make much of a difference, because at the moment, as I say, they're indefinitely extended on the assumption that the UK and EU would be having talks about it. Essentially what the DUP is asking for with the removal of the sea border is grace periods plus. And so to answer your other question, well, I'm not going to answer your other question on whether it'd be enough to see an Assembly up and running, because obviously that comes back to the applications of those 7 tests and how they're interpreted. And what type of action will be sufficient for the DUP to be satisfied that their concerns are being heard and that the protocol is being reformed.
Just quickly, I think it's worth noting that the grace periods, part of the unease on the EU side, that is likely to increase, because part of what makes a grace period possible is that when the UK left the EU, all of the laws were retained in UK law. So as the UK begins to diverge from relevant EU laws, what previously was EU law, then the tension along those kind of grace period arrangements in terms of the two legal orders interacting becomes greater, and the risk becomes greater, and that unease from the EU side is likely to extend.
So like we saw in the Queen's speech, the UK government intends to pass legislation allowing GMO products, genetically modified, and that often affects meat products potentially down the line, or agri-food products certainly. Those are where we have the most checks and controls, as Vivian knows. And so the EU would be wary about continuing on the grace period where we're not having those full checks and controls by any means, and yet in the meantime, we could see what's allowed in Britain diverge considerably from EU rules. In fact, things that are banned in the EU. So that basically the risk is growing as time goes on.
I'll just add in a little bit more on the grace periods. Okay, we have to remember that they are essentially a political decision. There is no formal legal agreement around the grace periods. And indeed, when the EU acknowledged what the UK had done in extending the grace periods, indicated that it reserves the right to pursue the mechanisms at its disposal under the protocol to take action for non-compliance with obligations under the protocol. Okay, so as the risk increases of divergence, and
what I'm getting is the EU would probably be less in favour of that than the UK. But if we've got a war on in Ukraine, it could be that part of what they're saying is that we kind of get everybody together because there's other priorities. Then that might have been an argument for extending the grace period. Looking for argument from anywhere, just so we can get an Assembly up and running.
I think we're going to have to see. But I think the important point there is the grace periods have been extended indefinitely. Okay, but at the same time, they could be called to an end tomorrow by either party. Okay, all right. And I suppose going back to another point, which I think Katy mentioned, okay, all this is keeping us away from certainty in the implementation of the protocol, whereas businesses are obviously looking for the certainty and clarity. And we just seem to be taking an awful amount of time, long amount of time to actually achieving that. Okay, all right. Okay, one last question.
You mentioned regulatory divergence. Is there any sight on what areas the UK government are going to regularly or diverge on specifically with regards to trade? And secondly, is there any appreciation of the economic impact of that, either at a UK or a GB level or at a Northern Ireland level?
Lisa.
There definitely is awareness. There's UK government talking about divergence and things. There are a couple of different strategies to monitor it, the Common Frameworks Initiative being the main one around divergence. In terms of what that is going to look like, the Queen's speech is one of the best indicators that we've had so far about areas that are proposed going forward. Again, we're still at the beginning of that process. I think in terms of the economic costs, it's going to have to be on quite a sector by sector basis and specific to the policy area. It's a complex picture, and Northern Ireland under the protocol, it's one that we have to, a conversation that isn't going to go away and is just getting greater. Yep, happy to talk further.
I think that there's a broader issue there about how the UK is managing the question of divergence and whether it's actually got structures in place which really do engage in what the implications are for the UK's obligations under the protocol vis-a-vis Northern Ireland. And then, okay, what are the mechanisms in place to actually solicit information and understanding from within Northern Ireland about what the implications might be. And I think that's a general reflection of, okay, possibly within the UK, the internal structures for dealing with the consequences of decisions in the context of the UK-EU relationship and the existence of the protocol have not been developed. Whether they will be or not is another matter. But I think certainly there's a strong push, going back to the point earlier about can Northern Ireland's voice be fed into this process to ensure that mechanisms do exist so that the implications of UK decisions relating to regulatory divergence from the EU are understood from a Northern Ireland perspective as to what the implications might be. So I think more work to be done there on the part of the UK government to put those structures and processes in place. Okay, all right, we're just after 2:15, so I'm going to call this to a close. Can I thank everybody for their contributions, particularly Katy and Lisa from our side, but also contributions from yourself in terms of questions, and thank you for coming along. Also to flag that we are planning another post-Brexit clinic, probably for the end of June, because as I indicated earlier, we're going to be doing some more polling and we'll find out what people are thinking about the protocol as we enter into this post-assembly election period, and we're dealing with all the fallout of that. So that will be at the end of June. And also what we'll do is circulate some of the links to some of the explainers that we've been pulling together, particularly around the democratic consent and judicial review. And also we'll circulate details of that governance paper that Katy mentioned as well. So thanks very much indeed for coming along. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.